Bees are a common sight in our daily lives, but if they gather in massive numbers and act under direction, they can become the most inconspicuous killers in a city. Serena was a struggling lawyer whose daily grind involved squeezing onto a crowded bus. However, this particular ride was interrupted by a group of flash mobbers. Wherever they gathered, they'd burst into a cheerful dance to the music. The bus driver was used to it by now and let them have their fun on the bus. It wasn't until the bus reached its final stop that the group got off and dispersed. But when the driver was preparing to hand over to the next shift, he made a horrifying discovery. Serena was dead inside the bus. Police soon arrived on the scene. When Nick got a look at Serena's lifeless body, the state she was in left him speechless with shock. The accompanying medical examiner's preliminary assessment suggested Serena died from anaphylactic shock, though the specific allergen was unknown at the time. That is when Nick noticed a tiny needle-sized puncture wound behind Serena's ear. This sent a chill down his spine. He couldn't help but suspect this was murder. Back at the lab, a thorough examination of Serena's body confirmed the cause of death as anaphylactic shock. But the allergen was something unexpected, a rare massive dose of bee venom. A single bee typically produces at most 0.1 milligrams of venom, yet the ME found no less than 10 grams of bee venom in Serena's system. Achieving this would have required a massive swarm of bees to attack Serena simultaneously. Following this lead, Nick took a sample of the venom to Professor Spinella, a beekeeping expert. After analyzing it, Spinella concluded that this venom wasn't from any local bee species. He detected a significant amount of phospholipase in it. In simple terms, phospholipase is an enzyme that accelerates the breakdown of cells, and it is not something produced by common bees. Next, Nick and his partner, Hank, began digging into Serena's personal and professional life. At the law firm where she worked, they spoke with several colleagues. The unanimous response was that she was an easygoing person who never had conflicts with anyone. In the end, their interviews yielded no useful information. The only lead they had was to investigate every passenger who had been on that bus. The killer must have used that chaotic scene as cover to carry out their attack on Serena. Unfortunately, the bus's security cameras were fixed in place and didn't capture a full view of the interior, leaving them with no clear image of the perpetrator. So, the police summoned all the passengers who had been on the bus that day for questioning. When Nick began interviewing a man named Doug, he noticed the guy remained way too calm and gave evasive answers to every question. But the moment Nick asked to see his phone, Doug suddenly tensed up in a flash of surreal horror. His arm morphed into a monstrous limb covered in sharp, jagged spikes. Nick realized then that Doug was a monster. This confirmed his suspicion that Serena's death was somehow tied to them. Just then, Hank urgently pulled Nick aside for something. To keep the existence of monsters hidden from the public, Nick decided to cover for what he'd just seen. But during his brief conversation with Hank, a chilling realization dawned on him. Doug wasn't the only humanoid bee monster among the passengers they brought in for questioning. The real killer had to be hiding among them. Since none of them were talking, Nick decided to play the long game and go for a bigger catch. He released Doug and another suspect. Nick and Hank then discreetly tailed them to an abandoned paper mill that had been out of use for years. Soon, a short-haired woman in a leather jacket arrived to meet them. Unfortunately, from their hiding spot, they couldn't get a clear view of her face. Suddenly, a single bee buzzed right up to Nick. An instant later, it was followed by an entire swarm. Descending upon them in an instant, the three monsters had spotted them and unleashed the bees before making a quick getaway. Nick and Hank, now pursued by tens of thousands of stinging insects, had no choice but to run for their lives. They managed to dive into a small guard booth, slamming the door shut just in time to keep the swarm out. They didn't dare emerge until the last of the bees had finally flown away. Afterward, Nick took Hank back to his place, so his veterinarian girlfriend, Juliet, could patch him up. Juliet explained that when a scout bee locates a target, it signals the rest of the colony, quickly relaying that information to the entire swarm. That is why, as soon as the first bee found them, thousands more instantly joined the attack. Nick was certain the woman in black wasn't human, but he couldn't just come out and tell Hank that. So instead, he asked Hank to investigate whether there was any connection between the three suspects they'd seen and the victim, Serena. After Hank left, Juliet confronted Nick. She told him she'd noticed he'd been acting secretive lately, like he was hiding something. It was clear his behavior was starting to frustrate her. More than anything, he wanted to tell Juliet the truth, that he was a Grimm. But how do you explain something like that to an ordinary person? His biggest fear was that once she knew, she'd be scared off. So, once again, he buried the secret deep down. Late that night, Nick returned to his aunt's trailer to dig through the ancient books. There, he finally found a lead on the humanoid bee monsters. According to the lore in the creature world, these bee-like beings called Mellifers, were the natural enemies of Hexenbeasts. He also found a passage stating that every Hexenbeast has a unique mark under their tongue, a key piece of evidence to identify them. Nick immediately called his friend Eddie, a wolfman, and asked him to join the hunt for the bee monsters. Eddie was like a walking encyclopedia of the creature world, but even he didn't know much about Mellifers. What Eddie didn't realize was that Nick wasn't calling for his knowledge this time. He needed his keen sense of smell as a wolfman. Using the lingering scent the short-haired woman had left behind at the paper mill, Eddie traced the strongest concentration of odor to one specific room inside, and there, Nick found a crucial clue on an envelope, the name of the abandoned mill's original owner, Melissa, along with her address. The two of them followed the address to a villa, but the place was pitch dark and didn't look lived in. Once inside, Nick spotted numerous dead bees scattered across the floor, which only made him more certain that something was off. When he opened the door to the attic, he was met with a truly shocking sight. The entire room was filled with honeycomb structures, each one bigger than a full-grown adult. Soon, police had the villa cordoned off. Forensic analysis confirmed that the venom in those honeycombs was identical to the venom that killed Serena. The presence of these bees was enough to make Melissa the prime suspect in the case. Records showed that the abandoned paper mill had once belonged to Melissa's family, but it had been driven out of business years ago by a corporate conspiracy. Doug and the other person they'd seen meeting with Melissa were her former employees. And Serena, the victim, was the lawyer who had represented that corporation and won the lawsuit that ruined them. Putting it all together, it seemed clear that Melissa was getting revenge on Serena. Just then, a colleague informed Nick that another body had been found in the park. When they arrived at the scene, they saw that the victim had died in exactly the same way as Serena. What is more, the victim was Camilla, one of Serena's colleagues and the same lawyer who had worked with her on the paper mill case years ago. However, there had been 3 lawyers involved in that paper mill case back then, and now 2 of them were dead. Nick immediately told his colleagues to bring the last surviving lawyer to the station for protection. But Nick never expected that the last surviving lawyer from the paper mill case would turn out to be Adeline the Hexenbeast who had once tried to kill his aunt. But Adeline pretended not to recognize Nick, and Nick, to keep the existence of monsters in this world a secret, also acted as if he'd never seen her before. After that, Captain Sean assigned Nick and Hank to protect her. Then it hit Nick since Adeline was a Hexenbeast. Serena and Camilla probably were too. So Nick went to the morgue to check the tongues of the 2 victims. And sure enough, he found the distinctive mark that only Hexenbeasts have on their tongues. Combining this with the ancient text that described humanoid bee monsters, or Mellifers, as the natural enemies of Hexenbeasts, Nick speculated that the paper mill's closure might have just been a pretext. The real motive was a species war. Meanwhile, Sean took advantage of Nick and Hank's absence to quietly approach Adeline. Adeline was terrified. She was likely the next to die. And on top of that, she had Nick the Grim watching her every move. So she had no choice but to turn to Sean for help. But Sean told her to relax and stay put. He promised that he wouldn't let anything happen to her. It wasn't hard to tell from their conversation that Captain Sean was also a creature, though his specific species was still unknown. But the fact that he could command a Hexenbeast to obey him meant he was certainly someone powerful. Next, to flush out the still hiding Melissa, Nick came up with a plan to draw her out. He summoned Doug again for questioning and subtly hinted that Adeline had left the station. Then, as planned, Hank made up an excuse to call Nick away. Seeing Nick leave, Doug quickly sent a message from his phone. What he didn't know was that the message had already been intercepted by the police, and its content was exactly the order to kill Adeline. Later that night, a decoy Adeline, played by a police detective, returned to her apartment under heavy surveillance. The real Adeline, meanwhile, was kept safe elsewhere with Nick and Hank. As a detective, Nick had a duty to protect her, but as a grim hunter of monsters, he could just as easily take her out. Still, he wanted to know why she had tried to kill his aunt. So when Hank stepped out, Nick started asking questions. Adeline was clearly on edge, but she refused to reveal anything. It was as if whoever had given her that order frightened her even more than the Grim sitting across from her. Then, out of desperation, she walked, revealing her true Hexenbeast face, hoping to intimidate Nick. But Nick was long past being scared by monsters. That is when the real danger arrived. Melissa had seen through Nick's plan, and Professor Spinella, the bee expert Nick had consulted earlier, was also one of the Mellifers, with Melissa herself as their queen. In an instant, she summoned millions of bees, all swarming toward the hotel where Adeline was hidden. Hank was the first to notice something wrong. The bathroom window was completely covered in bees. Nick rushed to help at the sound of Hank's call, but by the time they got back to the main room, Adeline was gone. Nick and Hank split up to search the hotel. When Nick reached the basement, he came face to face with Melissa, the queen. But instead of commanding her swarm to attack Nick, she called them off. She told them this was all part of a larger scheme. The Mellifers had been hunting Hexenbeasts to protect Nick, because the Mellifers have always been allies to the Grims. She also sensed that a catastrophic event was coming, and it was tied to the Hexenbeasts. Then she summoned her swarm to block Nick while she went after Adeline with her venom. The two women clashed, locked in a fierce struggle that neither seemed to be winning. From a distance, Nick had no idea what to do or who to help. That is when Hank, drawn by the noise, arrived on the scene. Nick didn't want to fire his gun, but when the queen bee moved to kill Hank, he was left with no choice. He pulled the trigger to protect his partner. As the queen fell, every bee in the vicinity died with her, and from the safety of Hank's arms, Adeline flashed a strange, unsettling smile. The queen's death left Nick deeply unsettled, faced with a choice between his duty as a cop and his bond as a Grimm's ally. He had chosen the former, and in doing so, killed an ally of his own kind. As a newly awakened Grimm, Nick still had a long way to go before he could walk a fine line between these two worlds. If he didn't figure it out soon, he wouldn't be ready for the coming storm.